May 14, 1916, a ranch in the Mexican desert near Rubio, Chihuahua. 3 armed men burst from a doorway on horseback, carbines blazing, charging straight at a lone American lieutenant. Takes careful aim and fires. The young officer doesn't run. Instead, he raises his Colt single-action army revolver. The lead rider's arm snaps backward. The horse goes down, then another shot. Another horse falls. Within seconds, all 3 men are dead or dying. The lieutenant calmly walks over to the bodies, straps them to the hoods of his Dodge touring cars like hunting trophies, and drives them back to headquarters. That lieutenant was George S. Patton, and the ivory-handled revolver he used that day would become as famous as the man himself. But there was one thing Patton could not stand: people calling them pearl-handled. And when they did, he had 14 words ready that would stop them cold. To understand why Patton cared so much about this distinction, you need to know 3 things. First, in early 20th century America, gun grips told a story about who you were. Ivory was expensive, refined, and associated with wealthy gentlemen, military officers, and successful lawmen. It aged beautifully to a warm yellow patina, had excellent grip even when smooth, and was durable enough to last generations. Pearl, on the other hand, had a very different reputation. Flashy, iridescent mother-of-pearl grips were associated with gamblers, showmen, and yes, pimps from New Orleans brothels, who wanted their weapons to catch the light and draw attention in dimly lit rooms. Second, Patton was a man obsessed with his image and legacy from an impossibly young age. Born into California wealth in 1885, he grew up on tales of ancestors who fought in the Revolutionary War and the Civil War. He was convinced he was destined for military greatness, and every detail of his appearance was carefully calculated to project that greatness. Third, those ivory-handled revolvers weren't just weapons to Patton. They were symbols, they were trademarks. They were the physical embodiment of his carefully crafted warrior persona. So when someone called them pearl, they weren't just wrong about the material. They were insulting everything those pistols represented. George Smith Patton Jr. was not a natural soldier. At West Point, he failed mathematics so badly he had to repeat his first year. He graduated 46th out of 103 cadets, thoroughly mediocre by any academic standard. But what he lacked in book smarts, he compensated for with an almost terrifying level of physical determination and personal ambition. He went out for football and broke both arms, yet kept finding ways to compete. He joined the track team and set the school record in hurdles. He became obsessed with fencing and eventually designed his own cavalry saber, the Model 1913, still known today as the Patton saber. By 1912, when he was just 26 years old, Lieutenant Patton was selected to represent the United States in the first ever Olympic modern pentathlon in Stockholm, Sweden. He was the only American among 42 competitors, all military officers. The event tested exactly the skills a soldier behind enemy lines would need: pistol shooting, swimming, fencing, horse riding, and cross-country running. Patton finished 5th overall and 1st among non-Swedish competitors, which would have been remarkable except for one devastating detail. In the pistol shooting event, he finished 21st. The judges ruled that one of his shots missed the target completely. Patton protested vehemently, arguing that he was such an excellent marksman that his bullet had passed through an existing hole made by an earlier shot. His larger caliber .38 pistol did make bigger holes than the .22 caliber weapons most competitors used. The judges didn't buy it. The protest was denied. This wasn't just embarrassing for a military officer. For Patton, who saw himself as a warrior destined for greatness, it was personal humiliation. So when he returned to the United States, he doubled down on his marksmanship training. He would spend hours practicing with his pistol, perfecting his aim, making sure he would never experience that kind of failure again. This obsession with perfection, with image, with being seen as the absolute best, would define everything Patton did for the rest of his life, including his choice of sidearms. By 1915, Lieutenant Patton was stationed at Fort Bliss in El Paso, Texas, assigned to border patrol duty with the 8th Cavalry. He had taken to wearing his standard-issue M1911 Colt 45 automatic pistol in his belt, rather than in a holster, a casual carry style popular with cavalrymen at the time. One night in an El Paso saloon, his foot slipped off the brass rail at the bar. The pistol discharged accidentally. The round went harmlessly into the floor, but Patton was mortified. Here he was, obsessed with being seen as the perfect warrior, and he had just negligently discharged his weapon in a public place, like some careless amateur. A true Texan gentleman standing next to him pretended not to notice, which somehow made the humiliation worse. That incident convinced Patton he needed a different weapon. The semi-automatic pistol, for all its modern advantages, had a trigger too easy to jar off when carried loosely. What he needed was something requiring deliberate action to fire, something with history and tradition behind it, something that looked the part of a cavalryman. He needed a revolver. On March 5, 1916, a very specific gun was shipped from the Colt factory, serial number 33288, a single-action Army revolver in .45 long Colt caliber with a 4 3/4-inch barrel, silver-plated and fully engraved. Overall length, 10 1/4 inches, weight 38 ounces. But the defining feature, the detail that would make this weapon instantly recognizable decades later, was the grips, hand-carved elephant ivory. On the left panel, a carved American eagle, wings spread in flight. On the right panel, his initials GSP carved and filled with black enamel. So they stood out against the creamy white ivory. The gun cost him $50, roughly half a month's pay. Patton ordered it from Shelton Payne Arms Company in El Paso and had the engraving and ivory grips done custom. This wasn't just a weapon. This was a statement. Within weeks of receiving his new revolver, Patton would get the chance to use it in combat. In March 1916, Mexican revolutionary Francisco Pancho Villa and his men raided the border town of Columbus, New Mexico. Villa's forces killed 10 civilians and 8 American soldiers before fleeing back across the border. President Woodrow Wilson authorized a military response, the punitive expedition, led by Brigadier General John J. Pershing. Pershing was romantically involved with Patton's sister at the time, and when the young lieutenant begged to join the expedition, Pershing agreed, making him a personal aide. 10,000 American troops poured into Mexico. Their mission, capture or kill Pancho Villa. For 2 months, they chased shadows through the Mexican desert. Villa was elusive, his forces scattered and hard to pin down. Patton, assigned to headquarters duty as an aide, was going stir-crazy. He hadn't come to Mexico to shuffle papers. He wanted action. He wanted to prove himself. And on May 14, 1916, he got his chance. Patton had been given a seemingly mundane assignment on that May morning. Lead a small detachment to buy corn for the horses. He had 3 Dodge touring cars, 10 soldiers and 2 civilian guides, including a man named E.L. Holmdahl, who had formerly ridden with Villa's forces before switching sides. As they drove through the desert at 50 miles per hour, an impressive speed for 1916, Holmdahl mentioned that they were near the San Miguelito ranch. Patton had searched that ranch the previous week and found nothing. But Holmdahl had heard intelligence that Julio Cardenas, the commander of Villa's personal bodyguard, might be hiding there. Cardenas was one of the highest value targets in the entire campaign. Officially, Patton's orders were to buy corn. He could have ignored the intelligence, completed his assigned mission, and returned to headquarters without incident. That's what most junior officers would have done. But Patton wasn't most officers. He saw opportunity where others saw risk. He saw a chance to make his mark, to prove he was more than just a staff officer, to finally test himself in combat, without requesting permission, without backup, without telling anyone at headquarters what he was doing. Patton made a decision. They were going to the ranch. The plan was simple and bold. 2 cars with 8 men would cover the southwest exit from the ranch. Patton, with just 3 men, would approach the main entrance on foot from the northwest. As they neared the main house, someone inside spotted them and ran deeper into the building. Patton positioned his men strategically. 6 covered the house, 2 swept along the south wall. Patton himself, armed with both his ivory-handled revolver and a rifle, moved quickly along the north wall. What happened next took less than 60 seconds, but those 60 seconds would define Patton's legend and his career. 3 men on horseback suddenly burst from the building, carbines raised, charging directly at Patton and his men. These weren't soldiers retreating. They were attacking, trying to break through the line and escape into the open desert. Patton stood his ground. He raised his ivory-handled Colt, took careful aim at the lead rider and fired. The first shot hit the rider's arm, breaking it. The second shot killed the man's horse. Both horse and rider went down in a cloud of dust. The second rider kept charging. Patton fired again, killing the horse. As the rider struggled free and raised his weapon, Patton calmly shot him dead. The third rider wheeled his horse and tried to flee. Multiple soldiers opened fire. The rider fell 100 yards away, but it was the first man, the one with the broken arm, who drew Patton's attention. He had gotten to his feet and was trying to run despite his wound. One of the civilian guides, Homdahl, gave chase. When Homdahl caught up, the Mexican appeared to surrender, raising his good arm in a gesture of submission. Then he grabbed for his pistol. Homdahl shot him through the head. Later, they would identify the bodies. The first man Patton had shot, the one Homdahl finished off, was Julio Cardenas himself, Villa's second in command, and the leader of his elite bodyguard, the Dorados, or Golden Ones. The second was Juan Garza, another of Villa's officers. The third man was never positively identified. Patton had just killed or been directly involved in killing some of the highest value targets in the entire punitive expedition, and he had done it in what military historians now recognize as the United States Army's first motorized combat action. But Patton wasn't done making an impression. He ordered his men to search the house. They found women, children, and old men, but no more villistas. They also found U.S. Army trousers and blankets stenciled 13th Cavalry on the bodies of the dead men. These weren't random bandits. They had been at the Columbus raid. Then Patton did something that would become infamous. He ordered the 3 bodies strapped to the hoods of the Dodge touring cars, like deer carcasses. As they prepared to leave, a force of at least 40 hostile riders appeared in the distance, closing fast. Patton ordered an immediate withdrawal. They drove back to Pershing's headquarters at top speed, with the bodies displayed on the vehicles. When they arrived, Patton walked up to General Pershing and reported his success. Pershing, impressed despite the unorthodox methods, nicknamed him Bandito and allowed him to keep Cardenas's sword and saddle as souvenirs. Patton also kept something else from that day. According to some accounts, he carved 3 notches into the ivory grip of his Colt, one for each man killed. Whether or not he actually did this is debated by historians. But the story became part of Patton lore. What is certain is that from that day forward, Patton would never carry just one pistol again. The experience of emptying his revolver in combat convinced him that a backup weapon wasn't optional. It was essential. In October 1935, nearly 20 years after that gunfight in Mexico, General Patton purchased his second famous handgun. He was stationed at Fort Shafter in the Hawaiian Islands when a brand new Smith & Wesson arrived, serial number 47022. It was a registered Magnum, the revolutionary new 357 Magnum revolver that Smith & Wesson had just introduced. This was the most powerful production handgun in the world at that time. The revolver came from the factory with a 3.5-inch barrel, blue finish, and walnut magna grips. Patton immediately had the factory grips replaced with carved ivory, matching his Colt, complete with his GSP initials on the right panel. The gun cost him $60. Patton called the 357 his killing gun, while the .45 Colt was his everyday carry pistol. He rarely wore both simultaneously, but together they became his signature. By World War II, when Patton commanded first the 2nd Armored Division, then the 7th Army in Sicily, then the 3rd Army across France and into Germany, those ivory-handled revolvers were his trademark. Soldiers could spot him instantly on any battlefield. The pistols, the shiny helmet, the riding boots, the perfectly tailored uniform, every detail was calculated to make him instantly recognizable and larger than life. Other generals carried standard-issue weapons. Omar Bradley carried the same M1911 pistol as his troops, but not Patton. He wanted his men to see him, to recognize him, to be inspired by him. And it worked. His troops called him Old Blood and Guts, both affectionately and with a touch of fear. He was demanding, profane, brilliant, and utterly fearless. He would personally lead tank assaults, expose himself to enemy fire, and drive his men harder than any other commander in the European theater. But that flamboyance, that careful cultivation of his image, also made him a target for criticism. British General Bernard Montgomery found him insufferable. Many fellow American officers thought he was a glory-seeking showboat. And reporters, always eager for a story, loved to focus on the colorful details. His profanity-laden speeches, his controversial statements, his dramatics, and especially those distinctive pistols. It was during the Sicily campaign in 1943 that a reporter made the mistake. Patton was at his headquarters when the reporter approached and asked about his pearl-handled revolvers. The question hung in the air for a moment. Officers nearby who knew Patton well probably held their breath. They knew what was coming. Patton's face hardened. His jaw set in that expression his men knew meant someone was about to get dressed down. When he spoke, his voice carried that aristocratic California accent, combined with the coarse vocabulary of a career soldier. "They're ivory," he said, ice in his tone. Then came the 14 words that would become as famous as the pistols themselves. Only a pimp from a cheap New Orleans whorehouse would carry a pearl-handled pistol. The silence that followed must have been deafening. The reporter had just been publicly humiliated and educated simultaneously. But Patton wasn't done making his point. He wanted everyone present to understand that this wasn't a trivial distinction. Ivory was a gentleman's choice, expensive and refined, aging to a beautiful patina. Pearl was flashy trash, the kind of thing worn by men trying too hard to get noticed for the wrong reasons. The distinction mattered because image mattered. And image mattered because leadership mattered. If Patton was going to project authority, command respect, and inspire tens of thousands of men, to follow him into the most dangerous battles of the war, every detail had to be perfect. Those pistols weren't decorations. They were symbols of excellence, of standards, of refusing to accept anything less than the absolute best. And if you couldn't tell the difference between ivory and pearl, well, maybe you couldn't tell the difference between a great general and a mediocre one either. This wasn't the only time Patton would deliver that line. According to multiple accounts from officers who served with him, he repeated this correction dozens of times throughout the war. Every single reporter who made the mistake got the same response, word for word. Every single officer who carelessly referred to pearl handles got the lesson. It became a ritual, a performance, another piece of the Patton legend. Milton Perry, who wrote the definitive book Patton and His Pistols, documented multiple instances of Patton delivering this line. The correction was so famous that it was included in the 1970 film Patton, delivered perfectly by George C. Scott in the opening scene. Decades after Patton's death, the line still resonates because it captures something essential about the man: his attention to detail, his concern for image, his refusal to let anyone diminish his carefully crafted persona, and his absolute confidence that he deserved to be seen as exceptional. Patton's insistence on this distinction tells us something important about leadership and image in wartime. In military history, there are generals who lead from headquarters, studying maps and issuing orders, from safe distances. And then there are generals who lead from the front, who believe that being seen, being recognized, being larger than life, matters as much as tactical brilliance. Patton belonged firmly to the second category. His ivory-handled revolvers, along with his polished helmet and riding boots, made him instantly identifiable. On any battlefield, when soldiers saw those pistols, they knew their commander was present, often putting himself in the same danger they faced. This wasn't just showmanship, it was calculated psychology. After Patton's death in a car accident in December 1945, just months after Germany's surrender, his weapons became historical artifacts. The Colt single-action Army serial number 332088 and the Smith & Wesson registered Magnum, serial number 47022, were eventually placed in the Patton Museum at Fort Knox, Kentucky. Later, they were moved to other displays as the museum evolved. Both pistols remain in pristine condition, the ivory grip still showing the GSP initials, still creamy white with that warm yellow patina that Patton prized. These weren't just the sidearms of a controversial general. They were symbols of an era when personal style and military leadership were intertwined, in ways we might find surprising today. The 14-word insult Patton repeated so many times became one of the most famous quotes in military history. It appeared in countless books, documentaries, and of course in that Oscar-winning film. George C. Scott's delivery of the line, with Patton's patrician sneer, introduced a new generation to the general's personality, brilliant, abrasive, meticulous, and utterly uncompromising. The quote endures not because it's particularly clever, but because it perfectly captures Patton's character. He was a man who cared deeply about distinctions that others might dismiss as trivial. Ivory versus pearl, a gentleman versus a pimp, excellence versus mediocrity. To Patton, these distinctions were everything. They were the difference between a soldier and a warrior, between a commander and a legend. So why does this story still matter, 80 years after Patton's death? Because it reminds us that leadership is about more than just competence. It's about image, about symbols, about the stories we tell ourselves and others. Patton understood something that many modern leaders forget. Perception shapes reality. When his soldiers saw those ivory-handled revolvers on his hips, they saw a commander who cared about excellence in every detail, who rejected anything second-rate, who demanded the best from himself before demanding it from others. The 14-word insult wasn't really about pistol grips. It was about standards. It was Patton's way of saying, if you're going to talk about me, get it right. If you're going to describe my weapons, know the difference. If you're going to judge me, understand that I accept only the finest. In an age where authenticity is prized, Patton's calculated image crafting might seem artificial. But there's something honest about his approach too. He never pretended he wasn't cultivating a persona. He was deliberate, methodical, and completely unapologetic about it. He knew that to lead men into battle, to inspire them to overcome fear, and achieve the impossible, he needed to be more than just another general. He needed to be a symbol. And those ivory-handled revolvers, defended so fiercely against any misidentification, were a crucial part of that symbol. Every time Patton delivered that 14-word correction, he was reinforcing not just a fact about his pistols, but a philosophy about leadership, excellence, and the power of uncompromising standards. If you found this story fascinating, you might want to check out our video on Douglas MacArthur's corncob pipe and his legendary ego battles with both Roosevelt and Truman. It's another story about how World War II's most colorful commanders used symbols and image to shape their legacies. Make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into military history's most fascinating personalities and moments. Thanks for watching, and remember, in history, as in Patton's pistols, the details matter. Get them wrong, and you might just get 14 words you'll never forget.